Hello everyone, today we talk about late Achaemenid tactics. We made lots of videos about the Achaemenid army already, however, we didn't talk so much about this is not going to be actually about it, but the core of the Achaemenid military per se. The ethnic Persian forces, what the bulk of these armies consisted of. Today we will, if anything, appreciate one of the most important keys to that, namely Persian tactics. I read this time in history. I have a series of literally tens of videos about the Achaemenid army, and half of it is actually battles. So in part, we already looked at Achaemenid tactics. We didn't just focus on them per se. Today we will systemically theorize that. The other half is like, other ethnic troops, right? Auxiliary forces that the Achaemenids used in their hosts. At some point, I will make a video dedicated to our sort of reception. As you know, I don't like much concepts like, the common imagination or this, as if we even had the presumption of literally knowing what people in general think about this stuff. We have arrived to a point in history in which people don't know about this stuff in general, right? So in part, we even erased part of the problem, but sometimes, unfortunately, and actually most of the times, that ignorance is never leaving a vacuum. It's if anything, even if that is the case, that is filled with some misunderstanding that always comes also from older prejudices, misinterpretations of sort toward this or that topic. Far from sympathizing for any of the contemporary Iranian ventures, so to say, also pretty lame Iranian ventures, but from a military standpoint, I even made videos about contemporary Iranian warfare. This is not the point at all, in fact. There is indeed lingering thoughts, namely the idea that the Achaemenid army was some sort of barbaric or disorderly, chaotic, hot-headed force, right? That would contrast with a sort of more advanced Hellenic way of war, at least until Alexander the Great, until Philip II and his father created, in fact, a very different military system from the one of the classical Hellenic polis, that in fact was based primarily on combined arm tactics in a fashion that is truly sort of unique and important step forward in the Western art of war. The Achaemenids had actually this mastered from quite a while, right? Just their sociocultural, political, spiritual background was really different from one of the West. So admittedly, what consumed itself during the Persian Wars is not just absorbing much of our attention of Schwerpunkt, as we will also at some point finish to cover some of the most important engagements of those same Helleno-Persian, so to say, clashes. But because the Hellenic world indeed had a moral capacity that at some point, in almost providential terms, the Persians fundamentally lacked, right? So I'm one of the first people that in absolute military term always stresses the fact that most obviously by the time of the Persian Wars, the Achaemenid army was self-evidently a much more advanced army than the Hellenic one. This is not a matter of opinion. I would like to stress how much this is not just like known. I'm very surprised sometimes in Schwerpunkt when after several years of military, historical, and strategic cultural teaching of the art of war, some people come up by sort of suggesting some either it's mostly always you talk about their country, you say that they were actually less developed than, not in this case much the Hellenes, frankly, also because I had never really touched on this broader topic, and say no, look, it was a superior army because it won the war. What the has winning a war to have with being superior or not as a military system? Haven't hundreds of hours of the Von Kriege series that very few people watch, admittedly, from the earlier years teach you anything, right? Haven't you still understood? What do you think, that wars are won because one system is sort of simply more advanced than another? That's not how things actually work, right? And there are countless examples. I bet that the same people who make this kind of claims are perfectly capable of switching to this other thought whenever there is a different scenario in which they have maybe to say that, yeah, okay, that bigger, more advanced power lost, but that those other peoples were primitives, right? So I'm always deeply disconcerted at sharing the world with many people indeed that are not really much aware of what the political, military, and social fundamentals of the same actually are, right? So let alone learning or understanding history by any minimal degree. The point that could be made in more refined terms is, of course, the fact that the Hellenic civilization eventually surpassed the Persian one, right? And incorporated also much of its broader universal dominion, right? Capacity, strategic harnessing. This was a crucial effort, right? And difficult, even in the age of Alexander, especially one of his immediate successors, whose armies were also gradually starting to cover. I can only tell you that we will soon have a video about the Seleucid army that I think I haven't discussed in several years. At this point, we really have to intensify that side of the ally a bit more, if anything, to have a much more frequent cadence in its upload pacing. In any case, the broader picture is the one of actually the most advanced army, for sure, in Western Eurasia, very probably the most advanced army in the world at the time. And that we have to learn to appreciate, in fact, in its capacities, in its strengths, in its weaknesses. And this is something we can only do through studying campaigns, battles, and so on. So videos like these are mostly aiming at providing with an adequate theoretical framework for the reading, the interpretation of specific of Achaemenid warfare, also the one of the enemies that were fighting them, for sort of all the other battle, campaign, military historical unit videos that we've already done. We'll keep making, all right? So the more time goes on and the more we're going to cover, in fact, more proper Achaemenid, also properly ethnic Persian troops. As we all understand now, whenever we talk about universal empires, there are really quite ubiquitous characteristics in history that are deriving from essentially the same political and strategic needs, right? Controlling a vast amount of territory, like in this case also in some of the most civilizationally advanced. Think about Mesopotamia. There is a great deal of previous military, historical, military cultural influences. Think about Assyrian polyurcetics, but basically the Achaemenids absorbed. You rarely hear even about Achaemenid siege warfare, but the Assyrian one, if anything, for iconographic reasons, mostly is more paraded, right? Just realize that, of course, these Iranians had been taking over. This millenary civilization had produced, up to that point, essentially the most advanced armies in Western Eurasia. In parallel, we know we're not talking China today, but aside from the proximity of different peoples that bordered with both empires, let's say, in terms of, in fact, of military organization, also service in the same respective armies, you have the series dedicated to ancient and also other medieval Chinese warfare. So if you're curious, you can look at that. There are some very interesting parallelisms, but also very important differences to be made. Another aspect about the Achaemenid Empire is that, if you think about it, all in all, it had not been a particularly long-lasting empire. It had been enormous, quite successful, and hadn't the Hellenes come on the scene, right, especially with the Macedons, there would have not really been probably an opponent capable of crushing the Achaemenid Empire, right? So Europeans came to dominate matters in many fields. Naturally, the Achaemenids themselves had been using Hellenic forces that had been fighting way before the Persian wars in Persian expeditions like the one into Egypt, right? There was well, a surrounding of the Hellenic world. Think about Scythia, that had been invaded by the Achaemenids. I also made a video about that. So one of the most important services, favors you can do to yourself is to count Hellenic civilization as fundamentally, at least within the sphere of influence of the Achaemenid Empire, if not properly within the empire itself. This is particularly evident for the Ionian polis of Western Asia Minor, right? Where I would like to stress, for example, what we call fundamentally Western philosophy, which naturally has much older roots, right? But say in a secular modern sense, was born from places like Miletus, and again, we will surely at some point touch this in our videos about history of religions. Naturally, there was something much bigger at play, right? But surely the Hellenes distinguished themselves for a much more conceptually developed understanding of the world, trying to look at sort of more universal categories as opposed to, I don't know, Persian mentality was, I don't know, this tree is just that tree fundamentally. And it was also a very primitive, archaic mentality in itself, like the Medians, if you look at the origins of the same Achaemenid dynasty, there was a very heavy influence, to say the least, from not just the Iranian culture of the steppes, but in that sense with a much wider Indo-European way of war that, in the case of the Persians, was incarnated by the core of heavy cavalry that fundamentally dominated, differently from the Mesopotamian armies, were admittedly based on chariot warfare, but that had not yet quite developed a full core of cavalry. This admittedly happens because of the gradual progression and development of cavalry as a proper arm on its own, but there is no doubt that the Persians injected that through the steppe origins of the empire, and also in the sense a thing that accommodates them with other populations that kept pouring from the north. If you look at the Sakas, if you look at the Parni, so the later Parthians, the Arsacid dynasty, etc., you realize that there was a lot of actually top equestrian military technology at work there. The Arsacids were basically, together with certain other peoples of Central Asia, the greatest users of proper cataphract warfare. Not even the Sasanians later had the full cataphract horse, right? They tended to split that with at least with half of the armor. The frontal one, for example, already existed in Achaemenid times, but I meant that the Arsacid cataphract model included even archery functions, right, missile capacities, and the Sasanians split that into instead like the heavier cataphract, half cataphract, essentially cavalry with horse archery. And so you can definitely read the relatively, again, few centuries of Achaemenid rule as part of a much bigger art of war history chapter and or continuation from other ones that we investigated, for example, in the videos about the Saka auxiliaries in the Achaemenid army. All right. I will not here talk too much about sources because we will have the opportunity here to cite directly from the primary ones as far as what we know about the late Achaemenid tactics are concerned. But it's obvious that most of what we know about the Achaemenid army stems from the Hellenic world, and the Hellenistic tradition as well, what had been salvaged, preserved of the many sources that also went lost throughout the course of antiquity, late antiquity, etc., regarding this immense empire and beyond. Right, the Westerners indeed had truly founded modern historiography, and we had a massive analytical and critical edge over these peoples. I mean, somebody who could author the Quirinopedia and at the same time to champion like an Hellenic way of war is I would say, if you know to what I'm referring, really the edge that we are seeking to understand also why eventually the Hellenes prevailed on the Persian Empire, right? So it's a discourse that we will surely expand further in many other videos, because I can't get away just with this in this single video about late Achaemenid tactics. By the way, why late Achaemenid tactics? Well, there are two reasons. First of all, I follow in the various series that I structured Schwerpunkt in a more properly classical Hellenic metered, so to say, phase. So probably the one of the Persian Wars, all right, that therefore looks mostly at that phase up to basically the early 4th century BC, and then fundamentally what happens later. And here, in fact, we're exactly looking at that. Alexander the Great cuts a short Achaemenid history, in fact, within the same 4th century. As we've seen also in some videos about Alexander's warfare, I have to complete my series about Alexander in Afghanistan. As a matter of fact, it is not exactly sort of looking at the Achaemenids, but let's say at the northeastern provinces and frontier of their empire after Gaugamela, the Persian gates, and so on. The other reason is that indeed the Persian Wars do actually mark a very important watershed in, first of all, our understanding of the Persians. Obviously, the Hellenes never saw the Persian Empire in the same way after the Persian Wars. And secondly, because the same Achaemenid military did go under some significant change in these generations that separated from the in between essentially the Persian Wars and Alexander's conquest. I already made a video last year that was actually 2 years ago, late Achaemenid army development, 479, 334, which is exactly the last timeline that we have outlined. And it has to do with Hellenic mercenaries, the Kardakis, the Gerophoroi, etc., that we will in part discuss today. And so, to make the long story short, it seems that the Achaemenid Empire began displaying, at least, we can't think about military reform, because military reforms, frankly, do not quite exist, at least most of the times in the way we understand it, especially also in an empire like the Achaemenid one. It's not just very archaic in some ways, but it has, it's really for everybody else in the same historical era. But there was not a particularly statalized empire, right? Essentially, you have, like it happened in other times in history, an Iranian control over certain parts of Mesopotamia, the most advanced ones, representing, think about during the Sasanian era, or in some ways even during the Abbasid Caliphate's times of the Seljuk era. This more warlike Iranian plateau that is routinely reinforced with different nomadic groups coming from the north. At some point also, again, like in what we just said, the Turks, the Mongols arrived, etc. The various waves of peoples from the steppes that Lord hegemonize the Mesopotamian world that, as we were saying, at this point was one of the single most advanced and rich places in the globe. And so from there, from the latter point, the Persians managed to establish something like a state, naturally working on the previous administration, etc., something very different from what they had in the Persian upland that really and simply was not able to fully sustain it. Like Western Persia did, of course, have an important level of urbanization, obviously an important bureaucracy of some sort, but the inherent mechanics of government, of military settlement are very different, right? And so this we will perhaps look better at in a video dedicated to the Achaemenid army organization per se. We already discussed this even through the aforementioned auxiliary forces, because you have to understand with an empire that stretched from the Aegean to the Indus, like how they could also simply control this through the relations with the various subject populations. And to make the long story short, it seems that the late Achaemenid army underwent, if you think about it, kind of an obvious development. More time passes. This happens for different empires. That there is sort of gentrification, a softening up of the originary archaic warrior ethos, I stress coming fundamentally from the steppes and or from sort of very feudal, equestrianly minded cultures to begin with some also important tribal base, that naturally saw in the exercise of arms the raison d'etre of everything, right? World domination as the sole purpose. There is all a Persian spirituality and Achaemenid mystique about this, toward a more restricted yet professional type of force that, in the meanwhile, was also receiving, in fact, the influences of an expanding, at this point, probably almost uncheckedly expanding Hellenic civilization, if anything, Hellenic military culture as well, with the winners of the Persian Wars, namely the classical hoplites, being increasingly imitated by the surrounding peoples. It's not like the Achaemenids decided to fight like hoplites, also because nobody could, not even most Greeks could fight as hoplites, telling the truth, as what we understand of sort of Hellenic, classical Hellenic phalanxes. It's a process, as you know, reaches maturity during the Peloponnesian War and only on the basis of Attica and the Peloponnese. And that wasn't used by the Greeks, in fact, in the way we intended, even, in the various colonies across the Mediterranean, right? The Syracusans had something sort of very different. They also evolved later to a more Hellenistic and more expansive way of war for different reasons. But they start, in part, equipping themselves also as Greeks. There are troops that, by increasing their quality and professionalism, obviously tend also to be a bit heavier and to cope with the quite available Hellenic mercenaries. As you very much know, before we were hinting at Xenophon, ironically enough, were also heavily involved, as you know, through the famous Anabasis of the same author, in the Achaemenid civil wars, right, in the very core of the empire, right, of the Mashrek. So a lot is going on, right, and you understand why this video can't be complete and why we really make more videos about this. We just have few hints at the fact, again, that there was some slight change in equipment, it was heavier, etc. That's what I've already covered in that video. Today we will a bit trace this trend. We will measure it through the type of tactics and changes that we're aware of. Mostly, however, we're going to describe an Achaemenid army that fundamentally can work in the same way, let's say, were we to describe it for the Persian Wars as well. Right? We will just highlight what was apparently changing during this era and trying to understand also by which degree. The Persians would never think, they had to systemically or structurally change their military, their army. It was something simply could not be done. They didn't think it in those terms. They had truly ways to reorganize, to administer the same military bureaucracy, etc., in different ways. But fundamentally, aside from the fact that we know very few about it, the means available were limited in both absolute and relative terms, and normally there was an idea of a perfect empire that couldn't quite simply change, nor objectively, if you look at the practice of warfare, needed really to change in any particular way. When we look at Alexander's conquest of the East, obviously we read a divine history there. It's also, however, one of the few instances in which in a great war, in epic campaigns, one of the greatest, in this case, the greatest commander in the history of mankind was not opposed by someone who was even within his league, right? So things went pretty disastrously for the Persians, and so we have this idea, so this Persian military, it's almost a faceless one. We just know it through Hellenic flashes, through the early 5th century, during the Persian Wars. Then we know it a century and a half later through Alexander's conquests. And we sort of stick to the beautiful Persian art of the era, etc., but we do miss a bit the Achaemenid voice. And so with this video, we want also to restore a bit of that sort of fundamental that are needed really to appreciate also the Achaemenid military in its core quality. So very important aspect. And some of the things I'm going to say are relatively cliche, or you may know them well. But as we said before, this is a not even simply a monarchy. This is a universal empire, right? The Achaemenid rulers are kings of kings, right? It is the same exact divine title that you find used in the Bible, for that matter, for such figures. A Persian army involving the full levy of the empire would be led by the great king himself. It couldn't be otherwise, right? There were certain expeditions that absolutely required this. There were some of the most famous rulers of the Achaemenid Empire that died in war, right? And in this sense, with sending aftershocks across the entire world, for that matter, we can't properly grasp the scale of the spiritual might of the Persian establishment. What they had objectively created was astonishing, to say the least. There were inner clashes, struggles between various estates. We've seen it also in our Iranian history of Iranian religion at points. And this was also a feudal culture where the position of the great king was challenged by other illustrious noblemen. Now, in battle, the great king's traditional position was in or behind the center of the battle line, right? Surrounded by his household troops, including the elite royal guard known as the apple bearers. That truly reference to the Tree of Life that we just made videos about, and they have to do with world domination as such. Now, we'll see now how this position was precocial, naturally due to the importance of the great king himself. And it was also partially due, not every Achaemenid army is the same. Obviously, no army is really ever the same, no RA, nor organic, and so on. But because, indeed, the first clashes and the possibility to inject reserves, especially for this massive armies, was there, that the great king had to control all this progression to occur. It would have not made much sense, especially for the finest army in the world, to simply point everything on just the first lines. And so this is what the Medians would have done when they actually seized the empire, right? At this point, think about the Ottoman armies. Like the Sultan was normally entrenched on a field fortification, surrounded by janissaries, etc., and also directing this battle as a great orchestra, so to say. The apple bearers, by the way, were infantry guards whose spears ended in literal golden or silver apple-shaped butts, numbering around 1,000 and forming the immediate protective screen for the monarch. Their alternative in this battle line position were the kinsmen cavalry, drawn from the highest Persian nobility, who form a protective core around the royal chariot or position, and were expected to fight and die with the king as his closest companions and relatives in the line of succession or court hierarchy. Right? This was a war band mentality from the stamp. Like, you can't be less than your leader. So you have to be able to sacrifice yourself as much as, not just for preserving your leader, but also for possibly surpassing him in valor, something that the Achaemenid establishment would have, in fact, witnessed in the same array position on the battlefield. The last king, Darius III, who had ascended the throne around 336 BC after a period of court intrigue involving the powerful eunuch Bagoas, who had poisoned previous rulers Artaxerxes III and his son Arses, and had previously served as satrap of Armenia, where he demonstrated bravery by defeating an enemy champion in single combat during campaigns against the Cadusi, commanded personally at Issus in November 333 BC and at Gaugamela in October 331, after earlier setbacks against Alexander's rapid advance through Asia Minor. At these engagements, Darius drew on a vast mobilization from central and eastern satrapies that were the only ones now remaining to him, that included elite Iranian horsemen from the Persian heartland in regions like Media, reinforced by allied Saka, at least partial cataphracts, so heavily armored lancers from Central Asian steppe groups such as the Massagetai or related Scythian Saka tribes, equipped with scale or lamellar armor for both rider and horse, long lances for shock charges, and capable of envelopment tactics through coordinated flanking maneuvers on open plains that exploited their superior mobility and numbers to sweep around enemy wings. This is particularly important for a couple of reasons. First of all, we've seen the fate of Bessus in our series about Alexander in Afghanistan. This is the head of the Saka at Gaugamela. I also made a video about Saka warfare after the fall of the Achaemenid Empire to especially point out that the aforementioned model, the full cataphract horse, was actually established in Central Asia only after Alexander showed up around there and successfully defeated a Scythian host, as we've seen in the aforementioned series, the Battle of the Yaxartes. The Achaemenids had not managed, as we've seen in their invasion of Scythia, to draw their opponents out in an open field confrontation. Steppe peoples were much more influenced by sedentaries and their military technology than the other way around, right? We obviously look at with great, at least at this point in history, meaning that in the previous millennia, the Indo-Europeans had taken over the world and they had been able to overrun, in fact, sedentary cultures to actually make them become their own in a true sort of ethno-linguistic sense. Even there, we've seen around 4000 BC how the battle axe culture in the Baltic, the North Sea, was influenced by some Neolithic axes models from Mesopotamia, Cimilia. This is not much important per se. The important is that when the Indo-Europeans, like the same Dorians and therefore the Macedons, established their civilizational success in the West, there is practically never again in history the case of a steppe culture that manages to take over the sedentary world, at least in the West, and also in other places with much greater difficulty and eventual dilution, right? So these steppe waves historically tend to decrease in importance, right? And in this, we have the Macedons, we have Rome, right? And we do know from that point onwards, for different reasons in the development of steppe culture, that allows for better documentation, plus, in fact, classical historiography that provides with a great deal of ethnographical information, really, are truly responding mostly to, they're interacting in many ways with sedentary civilization to the point of creating solution to their heavier sedentary opponents. In fact, and this is exactly what happens. The cataphract is not much of an internal product of Central Asian warfare. It is a response of especially the western half of the Eurasian steppes to the Macedonian phalanx, right? And not only, obviously, it was heavy cavalry as well. And this is what we're seeing here also in the deployment, if you're familiar with the battles of the Alexandrian conquest of Persia. The Achaemenids, as we will see now what kind of importance that mounted element had, both in chariotery and cavalry, but fundamentally fielded a wide majority of infantry. That, in this case, even against the Macedons, had to be fielded in an even greater number, and that, in this sense, was the product of a further sedentarization as well as sort of rooting of the empire in an ever more sedentary dimension that required itself some sort of anvil and some outflanking capacity, with cavalry deployed essentially in the flanks, provided that chariots were used frontally anyway. But also these had been changing quite a lot, right? They will survive in the Hellenistic tradition, but ever heavier, fundamentally, in fact, to adequately soften up enemy infantry, creating massive gaps just by sheer power, like launching these this masses of hundreds and hundreds of kilos at great speed. Very, very different from the the chariots, in the heavier chariots from the Bronze Age compared to the Bronze Age that, however, had existed in Mesopotamia by the time of the Achaemenid conquest, were much lighter. In fact, the ones that the Achaemenids will continue to use them as continue to develop, right? And this for the simple reason that we've seen really often in our videos about Bronze Age warfare, that, of course, infantry were becoming ever tougher, as we were saying before. Civilizations, especially after the waves of the sea peoples, further the Urnfield culture, formation, etc., were tougher. They stopped cavalry charges, chariot charges, and also cavalry charges, because they will maintain the upper hand, as you see in, say, again, Macedonian or Roman warfare, in spite of the great importance actually of mounted combat. We sort of, for modern secular reasons that are literally part of propaganda ideologism, we radically evaluated the actual impact and importance of cavalry in both Hellas and Rome. As a matter of fact, it had actually pretty good cavalry. In particular, the Romans had something insane. The top were the Macedons, that were, in the sense, a true feudal culture that therefore could develop the strongest cavalry in sedentary Europe. But this is something we've seen already in other even military historical units dedicated to this type of knights de facto, right? But tactics, as we have outlined here, are actually pretty simple, right? The idea of having a battle line with some jollies like, I don't know, chariots or elephants, etc., and in the front, and or also on the flanks, depending on the situation, but preferably cavalry there to outflank the enemy and to eventually take him over once you had overrun the first, to the opposite wing, right, the enemy one, in the formation. Was pretty much the same type of tactic that everybody used at this point, especially in a sedentary context. So indeed, that's what we're looking at from, without any doubt, from the Achaemenid side as well. Naturally, there were differences, and in part now we will be looking at them. The aforementioned details, by the way, about these battles come from accounts preserving Aristobulus' observations, including information derived from a captured Persian document that outlined the battle array at Gaugamela, specifying positions of Bactrians, Sogdian, and other eastern contingents under commanders like Bessus, which allowed Hellenic historians to record precise unit placements for cavalry wings and central forces. This is really unique in many ways, because probably, again, our knowledge of all the many beautifully sort of well-described battle arrays for the classical, the Hellenistic era, probably derive from, also in part, from sources like these. All right. Naturally, Gaugamela stands out as one of the most important battles in the history of mankind. So you can imagine, even at the time, producing a disproportionate amount of documentation, and that fortunately preserved itself against the layers of time that unfortunately tend to wipe out almost everything. Even through this indirect knowledge of the type of source and how it had been gathered, etc. The cavalry here, I don't know how much we will be talking about this in the various sections, but I made videos about Sogdian, Bactrian warfare, and you know what kind of forces we're talking about. Especially in those areas, that was a hybrid between a sedentary and a nomadic civilization, literally the frontier between those two worlds. There were pretty good cavalries, even some pretty elite ones, crack ones from the higher nobility, but at most the earlier form of cataphract was just mostly like the first half of the horse, the anterior part of the horse cataphracted, that would have chamfron with some chest plate or scale, barding, etc. Probably was a substantial part of padded armor of some sort. We'll make better, because I have made a bit about the military historical unit. That's where we actually look at. We are fairly discreetly documented even about these things through direct and indirect sources. And some kind of, depending on the area, relatively resilient infantry, if anything, mostly designed to support cavalry or to defend fortified positions with missile capacity, could counter the horse archery of the steppes, horsemen, but also some good hillmen. So look at Irkania, for example, are areas that will keep producing this kind of pretty successful infantry. Think about the Dailimes in Caliphal times that for even up to the 11th century tended to beat like just primitive hillmen, even much more sophisticated than the horse archers of the steppes. It's a pretty interesting story for that matter. But at this time, there were also not particularly aggregated, coagulated forces under Achaemenid control. Mostly, we can say that every one of these people sent merely token forces because it was actually an incentive to participate to these expeditions and to advance in the hierarchy of the favored peoples. In particular, as you know, the Achaemenids themselves distinguish pretty drastically between the Iranian peoples. So the ones that inherited, that represented, in this case, the steppe military culture that the same Achaemenids treasured as the core of their identity, of their historical memory. And all the various subject populations were more often than not, in fact, the sedentary ones, right? And that had, at this point, also as conquered by the Persians, a fundamentally broken system, right? It could provide with some relatively cheap, light, medium infantry. And of course, the elite participated as co-opted noblemen, but overall, it was more about the famous numbers that the Achaemenid armies sometimes overly misrepresented for. The numbers of Achaemenid armies were enormous, right? They had an incredibly effective logistical system, but they were enormous for the actual possibilities of an army of the time. Of course, the million men during the Persian War never existed, right, in arms, nor were mobilizable or whatever. We just made a video about the Battle of Thermopylae, and at that point, aside from the most famous Herodotian accounts at Similia, we can't simply guess what kind of force could have been. Anything more than 50,000 men in a single battle from one side are wishful thinking, fundamentally. And so anything for the largest army ever between 30 and 50,000 does make sense in a single engagement. Darius III was ingenious in mastering resource quickly after defeats, but by rapidly assembling levies from remaining eastern provinces and securing supplies through satrapal network despite losses in the west, and personally brave in facing danger on the battlefield by remaining in the center mid combat, but not a bold tactician. Right? Eventually, he was obliged to abandon the battle. As that there is a story, Alexander throws javelin and whatever, and you know how the story ended. Obviously, Darius was seen as a failure in the end and assassinated by his own for that. But it's the paradox I was saying before, right? That Alexander was not matched by, you can naturally be partially forgiven for not being able to be a match for Alexander, but by sort of any more talentuous commander of similar stature. Right, and the Achaemenid Empire, as such, as the marvelous civilization it was, could have fielded one, right? But this may be alone an indicator of some sort of stagnation of general crisis, political instability. These empires created all of the sudden, right, tend to be, in fact, much shakier in foundation than they really seem. And so what happens with the Macedons, it's also something which, in fact, had been imagined, right? Philip II, had it not been assassinated, would have conquered probably Asia instead of his son Alexander III. In any case, Darius had been cautious and deliberate in his preparations, such as leveling the plain at Gaugamela for cavalry and chariot operations by clearing vegetation, bushes, and obstacles over a wide area to create unobstructed ground for mounted maneuvers and sighted vehicle charges, and would cut his losses and run when things went wrong. Fleeing from Issus with his immediate entourage in his chariot after the Macedonian breakthrough threatened his position directly, which you can, in a sense, understand, because he lived to fight another day. And in fact, however, again, from Gaugamela toward the east on a prepared horse rather than either make a desperate last stand or improvise a new plan on the spot. It's a bit difficult also to properly control an army like that one. So you look at Alexander, you realize that he had truly the divinity of achieving that. These battles were incredibly messy, and of course, as you know, part of the Macedonian line had been broken. That the Persians were winning there. It's mostly Darius's retreat that fled from the battlefield that allows also the much bolder in life-risking Alexander to secure victory. It was, however, an incredibly bloody one as well, that, say, at least not enough, however, to cripple Macedonian manpower, etc. So what, say, the ways of history are very often mysterious, as they truly are, the divine ways. And reconstructing these battles, at some point we will make, I know, Gaugamela by heart, but let's say, who doesn't really? But there is always that we will never know, right, with precision, everything that happened. Accounts are pretty, as I always said, it's pretty realistic, pretty accurate. There is not really much of a greater incongruence. This mostly happens starting from the later eras, when some historians come back on the theme and they want to add something on their own that doesn't make sense. It's just like some flowery note. We've seen it with Diodorus, for example, for the battle of the Thermopylae, for example, that do not make sense. Diodorus otherwise is a good source for other battles of his era, but when you look at the contemporary sources and in general consensus of these massive battles, you have to imagine that establishments that lived for war and took great credit for all their merit in it, like, would have handed down to us a pretty satisfactorily reliable account, narrative of what had really gone down in these major engagements, right? Now, Darius's approach reflected broader Achaemenid preferences for measured responses across the empire's history. Sometimes the Achaemenid army are, again, accused even of some sort of giantism. I remember there was a video on YouTube from a couple of years ago, I think, that was sort of describing this Achaemenid way of war as putting as many troops as possible in a place. It doesn't quite make sense per se. It was mostly just the scale of the empire that allowed for these expeditions that, if anything, were really daring in strategic projection. If you look at Scythia, India, Egypt, Hellas, there is literally not a place where the Achaemenids did not took some sort of greater step than their legs could afford, right? But this actually shows an incredible power in a massive organizational and logistical capacity to even get there in the first place with a functional army that almost won, right, in every single instance, right? But aside from the fact that things can go wrong and the enemy or also the climates, imagine also the sheer experience that these Persians had in terms of the various environments they had fought in, right? It's been in the first generations, especially of Achaemenid history, something utterly insane in terms of actual expendability. But of course, things can go wrong. This has not to do, as I said at the beginning, with the fact that these armies were bad or that you could have actually done better, or you actually know, first of all, what actually happened. And you could have improved the situation. You know that better than an Achaemenid king of kings and his military entourage. Like, doesn't make much sense to begin with. We know of debates, famously enough. If you look at the Persian wars, the logistical, environmental, the proper distance concerns were enormous, right? Its nature itself would have turned against this massive armies and their stretch, but that was exactly the point. The kings of kings could not but be gods that won the world through that fanatic effort. And this alone should really make you tremble, right? There is some ironic simplicity in the Hellenic classical accounts describing their own local petty things in front of the magnitude of the Persian army and making it out of there victorious, not realizing how, in the sense, great but also lucky they had been, by giving more credit, in fact, to properly the Achaemenid war. But as you know, the Greeks thought of themselves just as the sum of perfection in absolute terms. So they lived in a bubble even when they were fighting against an enemy across it. Right? So we have a very particular filter of this. And even with the Quadropedia, in an age where indeed the same Achaemenid Empire had opened up to the Greeks by political ties to an extent and so on, mercenaries, the focus is mostly like Hellenocentric in some way. There was a deep understanding of the Achaemenid world. We definitely get it from the sources, but this genius is also in the Hellenic world very self-referential, right? In many ways, if not egocentric, in a more precise way. These are metaphysical terms, not psychological ones, by the way, right? There had been precedents of this caution, actually. Like we do see this caution as well from the Persian side. For example, in previous satrapal operations where commanders referred major decisions back to the king at the imperial centers like Susa or Persepolis through courier and layered administrative channels that ensured royal oversight before committing to large-scale actions. So especially in the later era, there is no doubt that the age of the major expeditions, the epic era was partially over, and that there was in premise a great strategic need of conservation, right? Preservation of the Achaemenid territorial integrity, coping with the various peoples, in particular the Greeks now that were fundamentally entering this broader space unchecked, right? Also as a consequence of the hybrid that had been unavoidably created through the sheer pressure of the Achaemenid invasion of Hellas. They would provide the Greeks ever more advanced means to cope or think properly they could take over the empire. There had been a secularization, modernization of the understanding of the same, which is also highlighted by the same Hellenic mentality at this point. It becomes ever more, in fact, that goes ever more toward that direction that we tend to appreciate for its, in fact, modernity and sort of relatable mentality, but it actually was far from the Dorian foundations that had allowed the cornerstones of the still, in fact, working Hellenic force and civilization. Now, this other point, the Achaemenid Empire was a hyper-autocracy, right? Such central referral limited independent initiative among generals to avoid risks of revolt. This is in part exactly why the King of Kings was used to lead the army to begin with, also to properly maintain the sharing, the revenues of the campaigns within an ethnic hierarchy that could preserve control across all this immense amount of peoples, of races. And so preserving central authority across so many different provinces that stretch, again, from the Indus Valley in the east, incorporating Indian archers and elephants, to the Aegean coast in the west with Hellenic-influenced coastal satrapies. These provinces incorporated varied ethnic contingents, Persians and Medes as core heavy elements, Bactrians and Sogdians famed for cavalry, Indians with bows and elephants, Hellenes as mercenaries, and many others from Armenia, Cappadocia, and beyond. We've seen some peoples like the Calibus, the Drylai, some peoples of Proto-Georgian ancestry, or so scattered in a world that we know of, frankly, because they were associated with the Achaemenid army as well, at a point, even from compared to other sources, right? And sometimes, again, we get also from the Hellenic descriptions what these peoples were about it, and they sort of kind of make sense in their arms and armor. There is a categorization, a stereotypization, but it all fits with the rest that we, generally speaking, know. about the local polities, right? The Achaemenid army had a decimal administrative framework that scaled forces efficiently from local levies of tens and hundreds up to true thousands and myriads. So this is an Hellenic term for 10,000s, allowing standardized command, supply, and mustering from satrapal records and royal quotas maintained through royal treasuries, and inspectors who tracked troop masters' pay and equipment across the empire's vast extent. Right, the Achaemenids were definitely famous for their law, for their administration. They were less bureaucratic and more, again, autocratically minded than the, for example, Mesopotamian peoples. But they had also the means of making this enormous empire work through some of the most advanced and effective governance of the era. When the king did not command in person, he was traditionally reluctant to entrust too much power to a single general, for fear of revolt, as had occurred in previous satrapal uprisings during the 4th century, such as those involving figures like Datames or Ariobarzanes. With limited authority, Achaemenid generals tended to proceed slowly and with caution. Quote, indeed, it is the usual custom for Persian commanders, not being independent in the general conduct of war, to refer all matters to the king and await his replies concerning every detail, says Diodorus, reflecting the layered bureaucracy where satraps, coordinated with royal inspectors known as the king's eyes and ears, and the king retained ultimate approval on major deployments to maintain cohesion and prevent fragmentation. Imagine this world where, there is this autocratic power that manifests also through this decentralized officials, but you have truly eyes and ears. You have networks of spies. These places are not free. There isn't much of a local political organization capable of more than some levy militia force fielding. Imagine how different, how contrasting this was with the Hellenic polis, as a matter of fact, that were moving away, had been moving by this point in particular from the age of the tyrants, right, especially in sort of the core of what we understand as Hellas, to a quote-unquote, that was never actually the thing, but we call today democratic direction, was mostly some sort of communal organization where the magnates were at the top. But think about how jealous they were of their military autonomy, their military quality. As a matter of fact, the idea of giving, say, a chance to the subordinates to autonomously act with a degree of liberty is a very important concept also in, for example, Prussian military culture, as we see here with von Clausewitz's Avatar, that speaks of some sort of more elastic and truly intelligent strategic culture of Europeans, right? The idea that you can give a chance for certain underdogs to redeem themselves through the military service. This is how the Macedonian peasantry had been brought to the edges of the world, how the Roman legionaries conquered the globe entire. If you look at the Persians, or say also the Carthaginians, you know what fate awaited the defeated generals. You know how much more, even in Carthage, it was technically a republic, right? But how much more impositive the idea of an overlord really was. Just recently, we were talking about the differences between the European and the Semitic way to authority, divinity, and transcendence. And indeed, in this broader Achaemenid empire, yes, the elite could be truly Aryan, or at least Iranian, which means the same thing, telling the truth. If there were real Aryans here, was during the Persian Wars, was truly in the Achaemenid army, the literal people called, the tribe called Aryans, among the many sagas that fundamentally inhabited the northern frontiers of the empire. And indeed, there is, as we were saying before, a pretty staunch separation between this Iranian descent dense, and the other peoples were at large Semitic, and or in any case, in part they were also Indo-European, but they were not so coalesced at least in a way that they could do, as we were saying before, something against the empire and an imperial force that the Persians could project right from the Iranian plateau. So the Achaemenid army had been continuously fighting, right? But they also knew very well how dangerous it was to control this enormous underworld that was always presenting challenges for maintaining higher the palm of the golden wings of victory that flew away from the king who said even one lie in Persian tradition. The idea that speaking the truth was one of the greatest values, right, for the Persian nobility, next to fighting. And in general, the sense of this greatness of the empire could be the double-edged weapon that once, especially like the initial wave, the initial pneuma of this force ran out, could turn against the same dominion. For the Granicus campaign in 334 BC, command was delegated to a committee of courtiers, local satraps such as Arcetus of Hellespontine Phrygia, whose territory was directly threatened, and Hellenic mercenary generals, including Memnon of Rhodes, a seasoned commander with experience in Achaemenid service who had previously operated in the region as well. This makes sense. It's perhaps too little too late in giving confidence and trust to these subordinate peoples, but it's a plus. Rejecting the Hellenic Memnon's proposed cautious scorched earth policy, however, which would have involved destroying crops, grazing lands, stores, and even cities, or withdrawing inland to deny supplies to Alexander's invading force, while using the Persian fleet to transfer the war back to Macedonia and stir unrest in Greece, which was actually a pretty good idea overall. These Persian nobles chose to risk a battle on the banks of the Granicus River, although they were outnumbered in effective heavy infantry, in spite of the aforementioned developments in the handling of their own infantry, driven by the need to protect their estates. This partially tells you what the issue was. There was too much of a conservative, sort of exclusivistic understanding of direct ownership of these provinces that were the power bases for some specific elements of the Persian establishment that had, however, been oppressing the local populations, were just considered as, conquered peoples, as they had been, but that had much actually to provide. If you look at Hellenistic warfare, you know how many of the so-called Tureophoroi fundamentally were just like the average rank-and-file mountaineer coming from Asia Minor that was replenishable in great quantities, and this in part did fuel, in fact, Hellenistic armies' manpower. It's not like the Achaemenids did not do this, but they did so through a much less voluntary process, a much less autonomous mechanism, few cooptation, and or just in areas where it was probably not possible to more directly control this area. And typical aristocratic rashness motivated by protection of their own estates and prestige perhaps was such a problem, but it was not really typical per se of the Achaemenid approach to war as such, which tended toward the cautious and defensive in major expeditions as well, right? Such committee-led decisions at Granicus echoed patterns in earlier campaigns against rebels or in Egypt, where mixed forces balanced central oversight with local knowledge to maintain cohesion in multi-ethnic levies drawn from satrapies like those in Asia Minor, in fact, including Lydia, Phrygia, and Cappadocia with their cavalry traditions, and the Iranian plateau, Media, Parthia, Bactria with strong mounted contingents. So there is no doubt the system was balanced. Yes, they prefer to actually go and fight in open field Alexander rather than suffering again this destruction of their of their estates at home and to carry out a guerrilla war, but they also were able, in fact, to bring to fight these various populations that themselves were to be invested by Alexander's force. And so we have no ground to claim we actually know whether we would have run these places better or not. Indeed, however, Memnon on Rhodes had pointed out like pretty important strategy, and unitly the Achaemenid system was not simply ready to adopt it. And you had to respond to the locals as well. I mean, this mechanism ensured loyalty through layered command structures involving royal king, trusted Persians, and local leaders rather than singular authority that might spark usurpation. So it was a joint venture after all, and the decisions were a product of also the local understanding. It had happened, for example, with figures like Cyrus the Younger earlier in his rebellion against Artaxerxes the Second. Like there was a way to even get to the core of power with provincial forces, and so that was the same reason why they had to be partially oppressed, kept down. The best and most important part of the Achaemenid army was, however, notoriously the cavalry. We said it before. Cavalry of whom the armored javelin men, or on an unarmored horse provided by the Persians themselves, among others from the Iranian nobility, was the commonest, right? Not the most quality, but some sort of, say, by equipment, medium cavalry that would, say, normally engage into hand-to-hand combat, but also skirmish before doing so. Right, we're not talking even probably about horse archery, such that mostly came from the northeastern frontier. Naturally, Persians were pretty skilled with bows, and their infantry also had a lot of missile potential. This is the equivalent of the Iranian mountaineers, the hillmen, right? The idea of an infantry is not too heavy, but can also use a shock combat to have a reason of the enemy that, let's stress it, as for most cultures, is basically the same locals, right? You know, this type of war was more owing to the local conditions than the enemies that were fighting. This is really normal, right? And of course, like, warfare was not so particularly different across the sedentary world at this point, except Persian culture in particular is feudal in nature. So these mountaineers are not just sort of more clanically oriented like, I don't know, the Italics, the Celts. Essentially, the Hellenists themselves are the development of that kind of tribal background. As you know, the tribal district is something that survives, in fact, in classical antiquity as well as a community, as a pool of recruitment. We've seen the tribus of Rome, also in a recent video about republican institutions. The idea being indeed that the more autocratic steppe model works as in the Middle Ages. There is one guy that basically the entire community works for, right, in order to provide him with a war horse. And so, speaking of a level of submission, I mean, certain elements of these territories to their own ethnic but non-social equivalent, right? And this distance, this hierarchy, naturally was very much felt among the Persians themselves. But Iranian infantry, in this sense, is pretty good, right? It's not very different from what you see also in the Apennine Peninsula. They're tough troops. Just at this point in history, in open field, they're not really good for much, right? In against cavalry forces, etc. They can make mass numbers. They do have a shock effect, but they're best thrown against opponents of their own kind, not against Macedonian phalangites. They are much heavier, much more compact, discipline, and so on. They probably lack the socio-cultural structure in order to cope with that level of European discipline and toughness, right? And large-scale combined armed tactics backed by a de facto professional soldier, right, under a very sort of also ethno-nationally compacted force like the Kingdom of Macedon, right? It was also feudal culture at the same time. So these differences are important after all. At the top stood, of course, the elite Achaemenid cavalry, known as Azabara in Old Persian terminology, often featuring noble-led units with scale armor on select riders, and in later periods on horses as well for, as we've seen, partial half cataphract style protection drawing from Iranian heartlands and Eastern allies famed for equestrian skills such as the Bactrians, Sogdians, and Saka, who excelled in horse archery and lance work. The etymology of Azabara, just for telling you how close Indo-European languages really are, is literally horse bearer. Like Aza having the same etymology of echoes of horse, and Bara literally like bearer, like Thoros. And so this gives you a dimension of even like the idea you're wielding a horse in some way, right? And so these ancestral aspects are obviously very fascinating. As you understand, elite forces like these were carrying out deep charges supported by armed retainers and household troops that leveraged mobility across open terrains, suited to mounted maneuvers, with nobles in the front ranks to lead by example and inspire cohesion through personal prestige and visible bravery that bound followers in tight formations. Right? Iranian peoples, look at the Scythians, look at the Persians at this point, had always been infesting Mesopotamia. Right? The heaviest infantry before the Macedons, and I mean the Hellenes in general, that the Persians had encountered were essentially, I don't know, the Babylonian ones, right? What was left of the Assyrian infantry lines that had influence, in fact, the so-called tacticae in Hellas in the past, even to Italy, to the Etruscans, to early Rome. In the sort of origins of the Persians, the only type of, there was no infantry that could simply withstand this impact, right? Aside from the fact that they originated from the steppes, but the type of infantry that we described there was essentially mostly effective just in mountain ambushes, right? Things like that. In open field, they could help, they would follow even as a retinue man, also with missile forces we've seen, but they could not withstand the shock of a cavalry charge. So this is very important because, as we explained before, there is this inherent tension in Achaemenid military culture between this originally cavalry, decisive cavalry system, and the later infantry-based one, where you had to recur also to war chariots, to at some point trying to break the enemy enemy infantry lines with this heavier smashing capacity, as opposed to the Bronze Age sort of softening up, showering, and still, however, charge was a bit underappreciated in general pop culture. It's not like, the caracol tactics of Bronze Age charioteers were enough, like they were a Browning machine gun to destroy anything that was in front of it. Of course, the shock effect was still the one of the charge. It's a very complex mechanism. Of course, the Persians had chariots also in the steppes. I mean, those had originated there, but the steppes also, for that reason, had produced cavalry as a fully developed arm, not some sort of runner supporting chariots originally. Before, in fact, any other people as well. This happens fundamentally at the turn of the millennium, the first millennium BC. Meaning at the beginning, right? At the end of the second. Let's say you understand the chivalric feudal culture of the world. Asclepiodotus says the typical formation was a squadron drawn up with as many ranks as files, right? So for a square, thus. As organization was decimal, rooted in long-standing Achaemenid administrative traditions, in fact, typically steppe-influenced one. We've seen it in the steppes armies organization. It's always 10, usually. And there is a reason, because it does start from cavalry, and mostly from lighter cavalry that does not matter to be properly ordered, and so therefore is not squared through rectangular proportions, etc., rank and file, but it's like counted in a quantity, and as you count with your fingers, right? This tradition divided forces into units of tens under a datapati, hundreds under a tatapati, thousands under a hazarapati, and myriads under the baivarapati, for efficient mastering. Pay and command across the vast empire, a 100-man squadron 10 ranks deep may have been the basic unit, as a matter of fact. However, 10 seems too deep to be useful for effective charges, right? Polybius, for instance, says cavalry are no use deeper than 8 ranks in most conditions. Consider that, however, Western cavalry was heavier in general, so the idea of adding multiple ranks, right, in depth, especially mounted forces, not like the infantry ones. They can't sort of push against one another, it can remain more compact. It's practically unexpandable. The cavalry charges are eventually just truly carried out, but just the first couple of ranks, right? The others gradually slow down or at least don't accelerate as the sort of full gallop in the last tens of meters, exactly to sort of direct themselves into the gaps hopefully created in the enemy line by the first couple of ranks, right? But the Achaemenids have lighter cavalry than, in fact, the Westerners. And so if you count skirmishers, other troops, retainers, right, there is a more feudal culture that requires some additional support. You have also some skirmishers in the front rank, so it's something slightly different by proportion compared to Western cavalry that is tendency just much more heavy. Like, you can imagine that segmentation in the Achaemenid line being very heavily armored front liners and much sort of softer troops down the line, right? Compared to Western cavalry that was also structured like that. This was also true for infantry. This is true for everybody, actually. But in the Achaemenid side may have witnessed, in fact, more difference across the ranks, with the last ones being not even properly conceived to charge as such. A 50-man squadron drawn up approximately 7 by 7, perhaps with the officer outside the ranks for better control and visibility, seems more likely, but this is also just sort of general observation. Like, we don't know how it actually was, nor there was a fixed way of going. Of course, things varied. If anything, it's the larger units that are more interesting, because when you evaluate also the larger expeditionary corps and so on, you have to reason more politically, strategically, organizationally, administratively to understand who they were. So it's more important than whichever sort of a small unit tactical array that is subject to variations, especially in mounted combat. This decimal structure, in any case, facilitated command across vast empires. It also shows how cavalry was dominant, as we said before, and the upper arm in the Achaemenid army. From a truly decisive standpoint, we have to actually assess this because it's not entirely clear how resistant, for example, Achaemenid infantry practically was, but indeed it wasn't simply to be charged into per se. Like, in some cases this could be done, but it was still heavy infantry, and so the cavalry of the time had just some limited options there. You have again, it depends really on who they were. Elite squadrons prioritized naturally noble front ranks backed by armed retainers for momentum in shock actions that complemented the Empire's reliance on a rapid response in frontier zones against threats like nomadic incursions or Hellenic expeditions. So cavalry, especially on the longest distances, is not actually sort of any faster than infantry. Actually, on the longer distance, infantry tends to even outpace cavalry. It's a logistical matter in different ways. Naturally, from Central Asia, yes, you can look at the Mongolian and say that it was that, horse breed that was specifically designed to carry troops across sort of deserts, mountains, and across Central. That's a bit of another story. This is not a steppe army. What, if anything, this proclivity of the nobility to move it's what you see similar to medieval Europe with the Crusades and its similar. Like, you have large estates that allow you to, first of all, that already pose you at the top of society, and so your stakes are into the empire as a business, as a whole, and you have the means, right? The wealth, the supplies, the backing, the wealth to move that much, to spend so many resources to go fight in faraway places, because you're going to have a return from that. And you're basically the only element that has the means to have this not just national, but even continental, in some cases, capacity to move, right? Which is not true for an average, Arab militiaman somewhere. Diodorus Siculus says that the royal guard at Gaugamela formed one outsized 1,000-man body, and Plutarch notes these were in a deep formation to protect the king, in particular, which, considering Alexander's attempt to reach Darius, makes sense. Cavalry would normally form up on the wings to exploit open ground. As we were saying before, at Gaugamela with few good infantry available in the main line, due to the emphasis on eastern levies that prioritized numbers over heavy close order training, which shows you the disproportion in quality with western infantry. Cavalry formed almost all the main line in extended wings. And at the Granicus, the front line was exclusively cavalry from the satrapal forces positioned along the river bank slopes. So these may be also exaggerations, right? At Gaugamela in particular, the fact that cavalry was dominant in this sense, it's not really correct. On the contrary, like infantry, there were chariots in the front, etc. And so that still shows how partially subordinated with the mounted shock force, of course, infantry was. But there was, again, a lot of infantry, exactly because you had to cope with the Macedonian phalanx in a way or another, right? So if you had to have this deeper formation in some way as well. And in general, you have some exaggerated accounts and or later interpretations. There's a battle like the one of Magnesia, for example, where the historians of the time tend to draw, for particular reasons, the clash between the Romans and the Seleucids as, in this sense, as a sort of Persian war, like Hellenes versus Persians. And so there's this idea. It was true that the Seleucids had drawn from all those literal satrapal forces of their own, because, as you know, the administrative core had remained like that, a bit like in the Persian Empire, especially in the Far East. And so there were people from everywhere. This army was enormous, but in practice, like we do know, the things were a bit more proportioned. And we'll make a video about Magnesia, because it's one of my favorite. But bear in mind, again, this idea, this myth of giantism that is usually applied, especially to Oriental armies in general, for better and for worse, right? We've seen for China, for example, the idea of armies of hundreds of thousands. It doesn't make any. It's not even. Nobody even begins to believe it has any adherence to reality, if not a symbolic sense, as you have to understand those cultures and why they wrote things like that. Right, but still, the figures do tell you something about also composition, proportions, and so on and so on. So this is similar as far as the Achaemenids are concerned. They're closer to the west, they're fairly well documented, but there is always this lighter exaggeration that posits them as, again, a bit more, quote-unquote, barbarian than they actually were, right? So, but it shows, for example, the case of Granicus, that indeed cavalry was still there. It was a hybrid, a tension, as we defined it before, between cavalry and infantry-led armies. This may have produced some relative doctrinal issues when coping with Alexander's forces, for example. But even there was a lot of cavalry from the Macedonian side, right? A very, very good one. At Gaugamela, Darius positioned superior numbers of eastern cavalry, including the aforementioned Bactrians under Bessus and the Scythians/Saga allies with their heavy lances and armor, to overlap and envelope the Macedonian right, exploiting the flatter plain prepared specifically for mounted maneuvers, while screening with scythed chariots that drew on long-standing Persian innovations in combined arms dating back to earlier campaigns against the Hellenes and others. I made a video about the Battle of Dasculion, for example. That is very interesting. Small battle, but it shows the power of Achaemenid war chariots, as a matter of fact, especially against fully formed Hellenic formation, politic formations. Now, several reasons have been advanced for the curious decision to hold a riverbank with cavalry at the Granicus when there were good infantry available, including Hellenic mercenaries held in reserve. Some think that this was due to haste in response to Alexander's unexpected crossing of the Hellespont and rapid advance rather than detailed planning. It's worth noting that an earlier satrap of Armenia, Orontes, had tried to hold the river Kentrites, modern Botansu, against Xenophon in the 10,000 in 401 BC, with cavalry deploying his foot soldiers behind them on higher ground, though it was not particularly good troops, and the Hellenes ultimately forced a crossing after missile exchanges and pressure. My personal idea, we will naturally look at battles like Granicus's, and also these other ones, because there is a lot of interesting military history behind this, all in the depths of it, right, in the details, especially provided by Hellenic historiography. Namely, the fact that they truly believed that cavalry could smash those infantry lines. I mean, I think that at Magnesia, famously enough, the Seleucid cataphracts crushed one Roman unit, right, which is one of the few, if any, instances of cavalry smashing an infantry line at that point in history frontally, right, which was sort of definitionally not the case. This was the heaviest cavalry out there. We can imagine that in the Achaemenid case, it was kind of the same. Like you await, it's like a ditch. Like you await the enemy to cross, and then you smash into them as they did. And this may derive exactly from the Persian establishment understanding their cavalry, after all, is pretty darn good. And whoever thinks, by the way, that ancient cavalry was not, that did not charge, okay, let's not be so extreme. I did meet people that think that, and or that they wouldn't think of smashing to infantry frontally, right? Just, you are going to be sorely mistaken in many ways. They handed mostly sandals. They didn't have stirrups yet. But the question is, cavalry does one thing only, which is smashing to the enemy. And so, of course, it has mobility. It can envelop, outflank, etc. That's the normal use. But it definitely can provide this really breaking capacity. It can put the enemy in pretty difficult situations. The answer is always combined arms tactics. Here we've seen it on the river Kentrites with some classical hoplites plus their missile capacity. We've seen it with Alexander on the Yaxartes against the Scythians with catapults and sort of infantry landings that allows also for cavalry crossing and deployment. Achaemenid cavalry would often use numbers and mobility to outflank the enemy, in fact, in a more canonical way. But fewer now had, in later Achaemenid times, the bow than in earlier armies under Xerxes, for example, or earlier kings even, where massed horse archers featured prominently, so they were less likely to skirmish at range and more likely to charge home, throwing javelins on the way in and closing with hand weapons such as spears, swords, or axes that emphasize close quarters impact over prolonged missile exchanges to break enemy cohesion through repeated pressure. Units on armored horses, often led by nobles in scale or lamellar protection with retainers in support, would often lead the charge. This shift emphasized shock tactics in late period, with heavily equipped leaders in front ranks to inspire troops and break enemy lines to repeated assaults, as seen in operations where Persian horse overwhelmed lighter Hellenic counterparts through depth, repeated pressure, and the momentum provided by noble prestige and retainer loyalty that maintain formation even under pressure from disciplined foes. This is really important because indeed the early days of the Achaemenid Empire had witnessed some greater amount of ethnic Persian infantry, right? Combined spear, bow, foot that had really been distinctively coming from the northeastern frontier, where infantry did exist and was obliged whenever exposed to cavalry and were not, because people lived also surrounded by these movements, these nomadic attacks, to developed a refined combined armed tactics, right? The larger shields, think about the Sparabara, typical sort of camping table, etc. The same missile capacity, we will fight in the shade, as as we've seen at the Battle of the Thermopylae, are a type of tactic that actually remains in the frontier areas where there are some sanitary communities that have to simply survive against nomadic attacks and functionalize their relatively poor equipment with this type of force, like spear and bow infantry as well. We will see it in the historical military unit. Well, all this had gradually been exhausting itself. At least the people who had followed the horsemen had eventually settled down, and as we've seen, conferred more power to the former that had become more elite, more somehow detached from the rest of the population. At this point, the best light infantry in the Achaemenid army were Persian archers and slingers, who were probably used mixed together in flexible detachments for screening and harassment, as was later done by Macedonian generals who had access to Persian troops after conquests and incorporated them into combined armed forces. They would screen deployment along with the cavalry and outflank an enemy or harass his march in hilly terrain. In particular, the drawing on traditions where archers provided sustained volleys from composite bows constructed with wood, horn, and sinew layers for power and range to soften formations before heavier elements engage in melee. At Gaugamela, the native Persian contingent mixed cavalry and infantry together. This was typical of Achaemenid forces. Perhaps, however, also imitating the Macedonian use of light infantry at the Granicus for screening and flanking maneuvers as well. So they revived part of their former traditions to meet the Macedons on equal footing. But again, the option was always there. We can't imagine any systemic shift other than sort of the availability of certain particular types of troops and their commitment in such circumstances. Indeed, a Persian army could produce a frightful missile barrage from massed archers, but as the traditional bow and spear heavy infantry units, the Sparabara, with large rectangular wicker shields, the spar, in fact, that protected archers in formation for sustained volleys from protected positions, seemed to have disappeared, as we were hinting at before, or being reorganized in the late Empire due to shifts toward more mobile or mercenary-dependent forces. In other words, these were the rank-and-file levies that were not quite useful anymore. You could find, again, this half-still tribal, warlike populations scattered on the northeastern frontier, but those worked already better as some sort of military colonists / local levies. And in bringing them to fight larger battles, especially of the twilight of the Achaemenid Empire, was a completely different matter. Indeed, there was a political crisis in the empire due to this social detachment from the elite. In other words, archery was now less important than earlier for battlefield dominance. All right, imagine. Again, we can easily see it even in the campaign against the Scythians, how more important in the previous centuries archery had been for the Achaemenids due to their steppe background. Nonetheless, the desire to let archers shoot as long as possible at an advancing enemy may have contributed to the preference for static and defensive tactics that prioritize attrition over decisive breakthroughs. This is especially the case if infantry was now present in larger numbers and in also, as we've seen, weaker quality. And so archers were the easiest troop to find, but these are not even technically heavies, right? You can bring them on the battlefield in large numbers, but they're not going to hold the line with them. So you can harass the enemy. Composite bows indeed are pernicious enough. You can make damage to cavalry, but fundamentally it's how you position. Now, there is no specific terrain feature you can exploit on a battlefield, or this is simply an open field engagement. As we said before, even against the same Persian cavalry, this is not extremely good infantry, right? You must have something a bit better trained or experienced to hold the ground, even as spearmen / archers. And instead, we see more archers. Achaemenid archers traditionally paired with Sparabara shield bearers in earlier eras under kings like Darius I or Xerxes for sustained volleys retained value in screening and harassment at this point, though their impact diminished. We see it against especially the discipline-heavy formations like the Macedonian phalanx with its long sarissai. It wasn't much about that. It was just that missile troops do not beat heavy troops, right? That's the difference. The missiles are light unless they are, again, double equipped, which is exactly what is decreasing as a concept. As we said before, also for the Arsacids, right? The idea is that the double function of troops, also this hyper specialization, depending on what we're talking about, multi specialization, is historically fading, right? It belongs to troops that have historically a very high pressure. They're very highly motivated. They also fight as a way of life, fundamentally, and you hardly have much of this anymore in the later Achaemenid period. All right, so the type of levies you can bring in are just relatively scarce in that direction. Mixed contingents at Gaugamela, so to replicate effective combined arms seen in prior defensive stands against incursions. There was maybe this illusion/delusion that the older ways could triumph just by bringing the renewed force on the field. God knows with which means. It's just maybe just an impression. In order to cope with the threats from Macedonian-style forces, right? So the idea is, yes, bringing a lot of men because you actually know that this infantry is not qualitative, but within it, trying to make something about it that can act as more combined arm tactics. It's not to say that Achaemenid infantry sucked, right? It's obvious that they could not withstand a Macedonian advance per se, but it's always, Macedonian infantry advance. But this is a combined arm system. If the infantry can hold long enough for cavalry to do its work on the wings, then the battle can be won anyway. And so don't even think that from the Macedonian side, those volleys of arrows from the massive Achaemenid host were particularly pleasant, as a matter of fact. Although some of the unreliable subject levy contingents from distant satrapies were similar light infantry missile men, such as archers from India with cane bows or slingers from other regions with effective range in open or rough terrain, even though we're not aware of specialized slingers like, the one of Rhodes or the Balearic Islands. They were generally, in fact, drawn up behind the main line of battle, right? So they were just a support force, as you would expect from the lights, where if they contributed nothing to victory, they would at least not provoke defeat by an early flight that could spread panic to the ranks via visual cues or rumors among them. So this is not a good premise, right? They couldn't obviously even hold the frontal lines in case of collapse, right? So again, these are relative anecdotes, right, that do not tell us exactly, because you don't bring these forces on the battlefield if you don't know how to use them. We don't normally hear this from any army. So the fact that the Achaemenid army, especially at battles like Gaugamela, has been a bit mythologized or commented upon, some of this stuff is by impression. We will, again, have to make an entire video, obviously enough, about the Battle of Gaugamela, reconstructed through primary sources. The truth is that we just don't know exactly how troops were arrayed, and we don't know this for most armies in ancient history, as we've seen also in multiple videos about the Romans. You think that we do know how the Romans fought a battle. We don't actually have a very good idea of that. And this is universally notorious for all those who have posed themselves the problem from a historical point of view. There is not the genius with the Kabbalic, formula that tells you, oh no, I figured out through the source nobody knows by definition, because who knows all the sources available on the subject, which is something you can't cover for antiquity. There is no evidence of that. But that's also how complex actually the picture is. for the history of the art of war in general, right? For the Middle Ages, you can't cover all sources for battle reconstruction in a lifetime, but that's why it's important also to confront yourself still with first of all, what we already know, what has already been historiographically ascertained, but also being always open, being always curious to anything, because studying warfare, the history of the art of war, diachronically and comparatively, is effectively the only way to understand. And so throughout the whole history, like the single art of war eras that otherwise lose a bit their meaning, right? Hyper-specialization does not help in a specific time or place in an exclusive sense for this. You will remain isolated without term of comparison. And speaking of these missile troops, their only effect on the course of Issus or Gaugamela seems to have been to hinder the Persian retreat by clogging routes with numbers of fleeing men, pack animals, and camp followers. But this may also be relatively anecdotal. These were big armies, and so obviously that would have been a consequence, but we also normally don't hear what was the skirmishers' role in battles, because it was pretty much universal and mostly buying time for the lines to deploy, trying to inflict some losses here and there, acting combined armed tactics with the infantry if there was enough organization, a solid chain of command, etc. But that they weren't particularly important, because they were surely not the protagonists of battle. So we can't say. Probably they were used in the most functional way. There were also heavier infantry levies, of course, and they came from across satrapies, providing the numerical depth but limited the reliability, often positioned to support retreats or occupy terrain without risking the core line, reflecting also the logistical challenges of integrating all these different ethnic groups with varying equipment and motivation drawn from regions spanning the empire's breadth. Imagine at the assemble point, like all these people are arriving from so many different places. How do we even line them? How do we array them in an eventual battle? Of course, they knew how to do it on a regular basis, right? Normally, the various specialties went together, right? But this is exactly the point. When these numbers come from so many different places, it's also difficult to glue them together effectively. It's not like you're misusing them or you're mishandling them or they don't know how to fight, but there is a moral dimension to their morale, right? To their spirit de corps that is less qualitative. Leaving aside the fact that, generally speaking, that the more you ventured out of civilized areas, the less capable these forces were. And that's why we shouldn't simply believe, again, that Achaemenid forces were so large, right? That may be the trope against the Western foes, right? Also because, literally, from an organizational standpoint, if you were a satrap, what would you actually send? You would prefer to send less people to erode a system, but with better quality, better equipment, right? So you had this wide range of provinces from which these troops came from the mountainous, from the mountains of Armenia and the plains of Bactria to the river valleys of Babylonia. Their supply lines stretched thousands of miles, because there was always some elite element that led these troops that needed some contact with along the Persian royal roads, with all the various warehouses, stock piles scattered as for the army to work. This happened throughout all great empires. It was used also by those who conquered the Achaemenid one and beyond. But you would tend to send perhaps compact numbers with significant skills and quality, so that there were few but good. But by scale, they weren't so homogeneous to provide that qualitative capacity that a more unified polity would have been able to field and to confer with, again, a higher esprit de corps. Apart from the small royal guard of 1,000 or more elite troops equipped for close protection of the king, Persia's only good heavy infantry were Hellenic mercenaries, who were the backbone of the army in many defensive and offensive operations and displayed remarkable loyalty to their paymaster through reliable contracts, high pay from royal treasuries at Susa or elsewhere, and professional ethos, with around 2,000 of them following Darius to his death, even after 3 major Achaemenid disasters at Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela, as they remained committed amid the collapse. This is incredibly inspiring as well. Like, it shows like the chivalric, knightly core that the Hellenes had, the hoplites really had maintained in Ember, right, from the archaic times, right? There was a great commitment. The sense of working for the King of Kings was an enormous privilege. These mercenaries were around for really quite a while, even before the Persian Wars. Fighting in the Persian army was perhaps like one of the underrated aspects of also the development of Hellenic warfare throughout the centuries that we shall perhaps at some point better consider. Right, there were some cultural differences, but the same Hellenic world had tended toward a further oligarchization and professionalization after, especially the Peloponnesian War, the rise of Macedon. And so also the disgregation of that more citizenry social order that had peaked during the 5th and part of the 4th century BC. So as a whole, right, the idea that the Hellenic hoplites are the crack force, right, they are the best troops that are employed by the Persians, is quite there. They received good pay. So as it often happens, mercenaries are actually very loyal, as proven in this case. We'll talk more about this because, of course, the 19th century and Machiavelli even before left us with some kind of idea that the mercenaries might just be, a treacherous bastard of some sort, but it's actually not quite the case. These were soldiers in any case. And here they show great commitment to the cause, in fact, to the very death. And we do see them, famously enough, in these battles, putting up the sort of the best combat and standing out even over the rest of Achaemenid infantry, aside from guard units. Naturally, this is not a good sign in a social sense, as we said before. The Achaemenid Empire had really deeply changed. They were wealthier, more affluent, but perhaps they were also going through a contraction of some sort, or at least a political rewiring that even without the Macedonian conquest would have brought to some sort of collapse after all, and or some gradual and further provincialization of power. Right? In any case, we do see that, again, power had become ever more private, oligarchic, professional, mercenary, already seen in other contexts. This doesn't necessarily head towards a collapse, a civilizational collapse, but it does speak of some shrinking at some level. And especially in the warlike character that had, in fact, identified the Achaemenids in their world conquest and the capacity to push further ahead. I mean, these guys from literally the Persian Wars hadn't even attempted to truly organize any of the expeditions for which they had been famous during the early 5th century, right? Something had really changed. They had basically settled down, and the Hellenes had been those who had kept them at bay. Remember that. So the hoplites couldn't but have some broader space in the Achaemenid military as a consequence. We also described the hoplitic panoply, equipped with aspis shields thrusting spears to Doru, bronze armor including helmets, greaves, and cuirasses, supplemented in divisions during the invasions like 351 campaign to Egypt under Artaxerxes III, where 3 of 4 divisions mixed Hellenes with local, quote, barbarian troops for combined arms flexibility in the Nile Delta's terrain, offering disciplined close-order fighting in phalanx formation that Achaemenid forces increasingly relied upon against internal rebels and external threats. The hoplitic steadfastness stemmed from reliable pay from the king's treasuries, professional ethos, at least in the function of mercenaries, because otherwise, as you know, the Hellenic world was mostly citizenry-based, but again, as social inequality erodes this mechanism, many hoplites go sell their services abroad in contracts that bound them amid limited native heavy infantry options that had developed or declined since their earlier imperial expansions under Cyrus and Darius I. These soldiers were largely responsible for many victories over rebel satraps as well, such as in Asia Minor, in Egyptians in earlier campaigns, and put up a brave and desperate fight against Alexander at Issus, which is in fact the battle for which they are mostly remembered, where they anchored the Achaemenid center in a deep formation and inflicted heavy casualties before being outflanked by Macedonian cavalry and Hypaspists, which perfectly illustrates what we're talking about before, namely the fact that Macedonian tactics were truly something else. Like, the hoplites were not meant even just, of course, in these bigger Achaemenid armies, yes, they had interior cavalry support, but we'll see better what happened at Issus. But in general, the idea is that the Greeks would not provide also, strong bodies of cavalrymen, that they would be honed in combined armed tactics with their own peers. The Hellenes had kept using phalanges. They had cavalry on their own, don't get me wrong, but they normally didn't sort of field large numbers of that compared to hoplites. Macedon comes about and changes the game, because it truly brings another arm of much more fully fledged feudal cavalry to act as a hammer against the anvil. And you see, in fact, how even the length of weapons was not even particularly different between hoplites and the Sarysophoroi. We'll talk more about this. We've seen Sarysophoroi in Christophoroi on horseback, right? Yes, because the Saraceni were also used on horse. There's nothing really leniently categorical about which type of weapon this is for infantry or cavalry. But, of course, old-style hoplites could and would be able to stop Macedonian infantry frontally, right? Because it's always about heavy infantry. We tend to think like scissor, paper, and rock as, here now I'm using the Sarysophoroi, so it's not going to win because, they have longer weapons against the other type. That's not what happened, right? This has nothing to do even just with, the Ficratean reforms that we also made a video on the relative hoplite of. This is literally just the same Achaemenid heavy infantry could have held the Macedonian pressure enough for things to be mostly settled on the flanks by cavalry, right? There was only a limited number of lanes available even to so rich a power as Persia due to recruitment constraints from city-state politics. So it was mostly also how much, as we were saying before, people could simply Hellas export, and as people could afford that their kind of equipment. Admittedly, many mercenaries just took it from abroad. There were people from incredibly distant and humble origins that would rise to some of the best mercenaries out there. But indeed, there's a style of warfare that very much just like the Greeks can simply replicate. Also, fundamentally, Hellenic arms and armor are the best ones around. The Achaemenids still defend themselves, but let's say Europeans have heavier stuff, right? Even just in terms of combat, they could be, as we said at the beginning, more limited, less standalone. You really have to, as an arm, right? You really have to wait the Macedons in order to step into combined arm tactics, just to meet the Achaemenids on same ground, not just like during the Persian Wars with sort of compressed battlefields where you had face-to-face heavy infantry against one another, some sort of fortuitous events, great timing, or etc. You really need something else to take on the Achaemenids. And so, indeed, hoplites had been heavier, more costly, right? In fact, the same Hellenes had been competing with the Macedonian hiring, right, within the Achaemenid army, meaning that there was a specific awareness, right, in the Achaemenid Empire that the Macedons represented the heavier type of army that now could simply take a leap forward. That's why they assassinated Philip II, as a matter of fact. So, given that the Macedons were lording over the rest of the Hellenes, some of those poleis that were under the Macedonian yoke, as it had already happened in the past, sided with the Achaemenid Empire. and sent troops like to support them. And so there is a dynamic politics in the Aegean, right? The Achaemenids were, as we've seen, often supplemented by heavy infantry of lesser enthusiasm or experience, who would usually form up on their flanks, as the Kardakis did at Issus, for example. And so those were essentially the better troops of the Achaemenids that were put on the flanks. The center was used by the hoplites, right? We've seen the Kardakis again in that later Achaemenid development. The Kardakis were not even a specific tactical type of troop. I mean, there were some general purpose infantry of mixed ethnic backgrounds, often young Persian nobles undergoing training or levied troops from various provinces, equated in sources to either peltast-like or hoplite-equipped troops with spears, shields, and bearing armor, numbering significantly at Issus, flanking the Hellenic corps in a double phalanx-like formation. It was deeper than standard to counter Macedonian depth, right? So they needed to be deeper than the same hoplites to face the Macedons. And represented as a force to bolster native capabilities through rearmament and training under Darius III's preparations that responded to observed Macedonian advantages in depth, cohesion, and Sarissa weaponry by adopting similar close-order tactics. This is perhaps also to push of a narrative. As we said at the beginning, the Kardakis, the Gerovoroi, etc., were fundamentally the natural response at a more rank-and-file level to professionalization, like the social inequality in the sense in the same Achaemenid army, Hellenic influences. You see hoplitic arms and armor, but this does not mean that these troops fought as hoplites, because nobody, again, outside of, again, even a very specific core of Hellas fought technically that way. We've made lots of videos explaining how the Etruscans and the Romans at a point used some elements of the typical elements of the politic panoply, but they didn't fight at all, like the Hellenes. Perhaps we have exceptionalized Hellenic tactics as such. They all fought in similar ways, admittedly, but the sense that the geopolitic compactness and the general dynamics of this formation were basically available only to the Hellenes, or they were needed only by the Hellenes. In this case, by the Achaemenids who had to face them, and the upgraded Hellenic Dorian civilizational army, right, of the Macedons, is clear through this. You can't touch it through the battle account. You realize, like in this case, in comparison with the Kardakis, how more relevant they were, right? And so the Kardakis were mostly just like troops that had habituated themselves to fight in this broader context, so they had becoming heavier, more professional. This happens again in other times in history as well. So it's not really the fruit of a reform under Darius III. It's a long-term process. We have very few both documentary and really sort of graphical and iconographic / archaeological information about this type of troops. Otherwise, there weren't even radical changes in the whole structure of both armies at this point. You know, also that Hellenic warfare, yes, had been changing, but by degrees, right? Until the Macedons, it was all the same story. Other interesting element here, seated chariots, when used, were spaced out at intervals in the front of the line, often in groups of dozens to over 100 at Gaugamela, with approximately 100 in fact on the left wing under Bessus, 50 in the center, 50 on the right, approximately. To disrupt the enemy, obviously, by an early charge with blades attached to wheels and axles that could slash into ranks, right? This is typical, again, of sort of cultures that tend to maintain some important capacity in a in this sense, dirigistic, right, a society of some sort. Like the fact that this will be inherited by the Hellenistic kingdoms, right? Think about the seated chariots still in use in the Mesopotamian plains by the Seleucids up to pretty late in time. They were enormous, right? Because by that point, war chariots had declined in their tactical utility. But if you could launch these things at speed with enormous mass, right, you could really smash into enemy lines. It would end up into a general failure. You could, at this point, it was more like a suicide mission than anything. You should have been closely followed also by other troops that could exploit, capitalize on this. But the important was also to admittedly disorderly the enemy formations. And say, when you look at battles like Gaugamela, for example, you understand that this was a unique chance also to experiment, to gamble, to say, well, we've never really done this in the same way against a Macedonian army. So this is also like the Achaemenids fought with chariots, but say in general, right? This was something that we're using in a familiar scenario where so that war chariot tradition had somehow preserved itself and refined itself towards this heavier smashing capacity. They were initially used against Hellenic infantry in earlier centuries. We've seen it at the Battle of Dasculion, with in that case with success, but in general with little success, due to countermeasures like opening ranks or missile fire. Darius at Gaugamela may have meant to try them out against the Macedonian cavalry on the wings or to disorder the phalanx, as most were positioned in front of his left and right, but in the event they were beaten by light infantry such as the Agranians, who countered their momentum through targeted javelin harassment and by opening ranks to let them pass harmlessly through prepared lanes, after which reserves dispatched the survivors. And so against the heavies, but also both cavalry and infantry, even if the chariots succeeded in charging home and creating gaps, they needed to be closely supported, as we were saying, by following cavalry or infantry to exploit the disorder they caused by pouring into the breaches. And such support was rarely forthcoming in the heat of battle due to coordination challenges across all these various multi-ethnic lines, the emphasis on the initial disruption rather than sustained exploitation. Deployed on the prepared Gaugamela plain, as we've seen the terrain had been cleared, these vehicles aimed to disorder advancing lines or cavalry, but proved vulnerable, with surviving chariots often neutralized by rare elements, highlighting the need for integrated follow-up that Persian tactics seldom achieved effectively amid the empire's preference for layered, cautious deployments over fluid exploitation of breakthroughs. It seems, telling the truth, that all this could have been and was likely a good tactical system, even for the time being. There was evidently a difficulty in coping with an enemy that had a much more effectively qualitative, disciplined, homogeneous force like the Macedonian one. But we don't have to, in fact, belittle Achaemenid capacities, even this down in time, if not perhaps from a moral standpoint, from the general spirit that at this point had witnessed, in fact, Alexander, or if we speak about Gaugamela in particular, winning over the best, in fact, of the Achaemenid armies, including the Hellenic mercenaries, as we've seen. But indeed, this is part of a series that began at that point, and indeed against a new system. Like the Achaemenids had never seen the Macedonian phalanx, right? They knew what it had been capable, the fact that the Macedons had been using it for a while, but the same Macedons had no clue whether the system could simply work out there against the Achaemenids, who were still the largest military out there. It's a bit like the Romans with their manipular legion that had, especially like they had met the Epirot phalanx in the same Italian soil with, but say crossing to Hellas was also another major issue. So crossing the straits into Asia, also for the Macedons, was a big deal with an army of that kind. So again, videos like these are always introductory. I don't pretend to be complete, but let's say we are paving the road for better videos that will, in that case of Gaugamela in particular, analyze better the situation. And what we talk about today is it's not sophistry per se, but it's obvious that when you are confronted with the battle accounts, things sound much more convincing, right? You don't really have to look at the type of unit per se. You can garner, as we've done today, some important info regarding what stood behind these forces, like, in fact, how much moral force they had, what kind of social cultural background and function these forces had. However, the real point here is understanding the quality of a unit per se, whichever it is, right? This could be a completely different system and performing in the same way, or succeeding, just like this system could succeed. Again, there was nothing inherently wrong in this tactical array. It was nothing fundamentally wrong in the general military logic of the situation. There were some mistakes were made, but before things happen, you maybe there is a likelihood that there is some sort of general thinking how things can go based on prior experience, but you will never, you don't fully know how this is actually going to be, right? You have no idea fundamentally how the situation can evolve. Thus, overall, it seems that this was this is also historically a pretty complicated puzzle to solve, and that's only by making more videos on the subject, and as I said at the beginning, more especially about the core of the Achaemenid military, that at the end of the day was what had conquered and held the empire, the ethnic Persians, that you can't see fully what this was. Indeed, the fact that ethnic Persian element in numerical terms had declined already is not a good indicator of the general socio-political background. But for the rest, we do have like an abundance of videos about Achaemenid warfare. It's obviously scattered. This mostly comes from the lottery, so to say. But overall, right, it does make sense. It is fairly good work in the way we organized it, and we're simply continuing with the same. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.